The golden sun was setting over the vast green fields, casting long, soft shadows across the serene landscape. The air was thick with tension as a group of veterinarians stood around, their expressions grim. Lying motionless on the ground was a majestic brown horse, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. His dark eyes, once full of life, now reflected exhaustion and pain. The specialists exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Their verdict was clear: there was nothing more they could do. The most humane decision, according to them, was to end his suffering. But among the adults discussing clinical solutions, a little girl, no older than 4, stood unmoving beside the fallen horse. Her small pink dress fluttered in the breeze, and her delicate hands clung tightly to the horse's mane. Her bright blue eyes, filled with unshed tears, stared up at the serious faces of the veterinarians. She didn't fully understand the complex words they used, but she understood their meaning. They were saying that her best friend had no chance left. Her parents gently tried to pull her away, but she resisted. With slow, hesitant steps, she moved closer to the horse and knelt beside him. Her tiny heart pounded in her chest, her breath shaky. With trembling fingers, she caressed the horse's muzzle. He let out a faint, tired sigh. "Please, get up," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the horse remained still. The veterinarians exchanged somber looks, silently agreeing that prolonging his suffering was cruel. One of them sighed, then gave a small nod to the girl's parents, signaling that it was time to make the difficult decision. But just as they were about to act, something unexpected happened. The little girl pressed her forehead gently against the horse's forehead, closing her eyes. She whispered something, words no one else could hear, words filled with love, with innocence, with unwavering belief. A hush fell over the field. Suddenly, a faint tremor ran through the horse's body. His eyes blinked slowly, and a glimmer, one that had been lost, returned to his gaze. The veterinarians froze in shock as the horse tried to move his legs. His muscles tensed, and for a moment it seemed impossible. Then, against all odds, he lifted his head. A murmur of astonishment rippled through the crowd. The little girl stepped back slightly but never looked away. "Come on, you can do it," she whispered. What happened next defied all logic. With one final, desperate effort, the horse pushed himself up. First, one leg, then another. The process was slow, trembling, uncertain. But before the stunned eyes of everyone watching, he rose to his feet. The little girl, her face streaked with tears, smiled as wide as the sky. The veterinarians stood in stunned silence. Against all predictions, against medical certainty, this horse had chosen to fight. And all because of the unshakable faith of a child. A strange silence fell over the field, as if nature itself had paused to witness the impossible. The veterinarians, once so certain in their conclusions, now stood motionless, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. The horse, though visibly weak, remained standing, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. His legs trembled beneath him, his muscles visibly strained, yet something in his posture had changed. He was no longer just surviving, he was fighting. The little girl's parents rushed to her side, their expressions filled with both shock and concern. Her mother knelt down, wrapping protective arms around her tiny frame, but the child barely noticed. Her wide blue eyes remained locked on the horse, her small lips curving into a smile. "I told you," she whispered, her voice laced with a certainty that defied logic. She had never doubted him, not for a second. One of the veterinarians finally spoke, his voice laced with uncertainty. This doesn't make sense," he murmured, rubbing his temple. He exchanged bewildered glances with his colleagues. "We ran every test, checked every sign." His muscles were failing, his system was shutting down. His voice trailed off as the horse took another wobbly step forward. He shouldn't be able to move like this. Yet, against all odds, he was. The horse exhaled a deep, steady breath, his large dark eyes flickering with something unexplainable. He turned his head toward the girl, his ears twitching slightly as if recognizing her presence. The connection between them was undeniable, an unspoken understanding that no science could measure. As if responding to her silent encouragement, he lowered his head, allowing her small hand to stroke his soft muzzle. A hushed reverence settled over the field. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if they had stepped into a moment beyond time, where logic no longer dictated reality. This wasn't just a simple recovery. This was something extraordinary, something fueled by love, belief, and a bond stronger than anyone could comprehend. Then, slowly, deliberately, the horse took another step forward. This time, his legs held steadier beneath him. He paused, inhaled deeply, then took another. And another. The progression was careful, deliberate, but undeniable. He was regaining control. He was reclaiming his strength. The little girl's father finally broke the silence. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice low, filled with uncertainty. His gaze turned to the lead veterinarian, the man who, just moments ago, had been prepared to make an irreversible decision. The veterinarian let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. His hands had spent years treating animals, diagnosing illnesses, making the hard choices. But this? This was beyond any explanation he had ever encountered. Finally, he nodded, his voice steady but reluctant. "We wait," he said. "If he wants to fight, we have to let him." The little girl beamed, tears still glistening in her eyes. She ran her fingers gently along the horse's face, her touch soft but full of warmth. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, her words carrying the weight of a promise. "I just know it." And for the first time in what felt like forever, the impossible no longer seemed so out of reach. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the field. The tension that had once gripped the air was now replaced with cautious hope. The horse, though still weak, stood tall, his breathing steadying with each passing moment. His dark eyes flickered with something undeniable: life, determination, a will to keep going. The veterinarians, still struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed, gathered a few feet away, their hushed voices carrying uncertainty. One of them, a middle-aged man with deep lines etched across his face, shook his head. "I don't understand," he muttered. By all medical reasoning, he should be collapsing, not standing. He turned toward the lead veterinarian, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet. "What do we do now?" The lead veterinarian, a man who had seen countless cases over the years, crossed his arms. His eyes remained fixed on the horse, studying him carefully. "We reassess," he finally said. "If he's standing, then we give him a chance." His voice, though measured, carried the weight of a decision that went against everything he had believed just moments ago. The little girl, still standing beside her beloved companion, let out a small giggle. She hadn't doubted for a second that he would make it. To her, there had never been a question of whether he would fight, only whether the grown-ups would believe in him the way she did. She reached up, gently running her tiny fingers along his face. "See?" she whispered. "You're strong. I knew you wouldn't leave me." The horse let out a low, rumbling breath, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder as if responding to her words. It was a gesture of trust, of understanding. The veterinarians exchanged glances, their skepticism slowly giving way to something else: admiration. One of them stepped forward hesitantly. "If we're really doing this, we need to take precautions," he said. "He'll need fluids, rest, proper monitoring. We can't assume this is a full recovery just yet." The little girl's father nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes." His voice was firm, resolute. He knelt beside his daughter, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "But we have to listen to the doctors, sweetheart. If he's going to get better, we need to help him." The little girl looked up at her father, then back at the veterinarians, her small face serious. "I'll help too," she said softly. "I'll stay with him. He needs me." No one had the heart to tell her otherwise. As the night began to settle, the family and veterinarians worked together, carefully setting up a temporary area where the horse could rest safely. They brought blankets, water, and gentle hands to tend to him. But through it all, the little girl never left his side. She sat beside him as the stars began to appear, her fingers tracing small patterns on his fur. "You're going to be okay," she whispered one last time before resting her head against him. And for the first time in days, the night felt peaceful. The night stretched across the sky, stars shimmering like tiny lanterns above the quiet field. A soft breeze rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of the earth and the warmth of summer air. The little girl sat curled up beside the horse, her small body nestled against his as she refused to leave his side. Her tiny fingers traced slow, careful circles along his fur, as if her touch alone could keep him strong. The veterinarians had done everything they could for the night. They set up a shaded resting area, provided fluids, and monitored his breathing. But even as they followed every protocol, they knew deep down, this was no ordinary recovery. What had happened today defied logic, defied medicine. And yet, there he was, his large, weary body stretched out in the grass, his breathing deep but steady. Still alive. Still fighting. Her father had tried convincing her to come inside, to rest, but she had simply shaken her head. "He needs me," she whispered, her voice unwavering. Her mother draped a light blanket over her shoulders, pressing a kiss to her forehead before retreating. They understood now. This bond wasn't something they could break. The horse stirred slightly, shifting his weight. His deep, dark eyes opened, reflecting the glow of the moon above. Slowly, he turned his head toward the little girl, his ears twitching at the sound of her soft breathing. He let out a low, quiet exhale, pressing his muzzle gently against her arm. The little girl smiled, though her eyes were heavy with sleep. "You're getting better," she murmured, her words barely above a whisper. "I knew you would." She rested her head against his strong neck, her small hand never leaving him. Nearby, the lead veterinarian sat with a clipboard resting against his knee, watching the scene unfold. He had spent decades treating animals, witnessing miracles and heartbreaks alike. But this was something different. He turned to one of his colleagues, his voice low. "I don't think this is just a physical recovery," he admitted. "That child, she's keeping him here." The other veterinarian nodded slowly, watching as the little girl's steady breaths matched the slow rise and fall of the horse's chest. "She believes in him," he murmured. "And somehow, that's enough." The night deepened, and exhaustion finally took over. The little girl's body relaxed, her breathing even as sleep claimed her. But even in sleep, her fingers remained tangled in the horse's mane, as if afraid to let go. And the horse? He remained still, his body tired but his spirit unbroken. His ears flicked as he listened to the gentle sounds of the night, the rustling trees, the distant chirping of crickets, the soft, steady heartbeat of the little girl beside him. For the first time in days, he felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Hope. The first rays of morning light painted the horizon in soft shades of gold and pink. A faint mist hung over the field, giving the world a quiet, almost dreamlike stillness. The little girl stirred, her small body shifting against the warmth of the horse's side. Her fingers, still tangled in his mane, twitched slightly as her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she was unsure if the events of the previous night had been real. Had he truly stood up? Had he truly fought to stay? But as she lifted her head, she saw his dark eyes gazing back at her, filled with something deep and steady, recognition. A smile broke across her sleepy face. "You're still here," she whispered, as if she had been afraid he would disappear with the night. She reached up, gently stroking his muzzle. The horse let out a slow breath, pressing his head lightly against her hand. It was the softest of gestures, but to her, it meant everything. Footsteps approached from behind. Her father and the veterinarians had returned, their faces cautious, almost hesitant. The lead veterinarian stepped forward first, adjusting the stethoscope around his neck before kneeling beside the horse. His fingers moved carefully, checking for tension, for pain, for signs of weakness. The little girl watched closely, biting her lip as she waited for him to speak. After a long moment, he exhaled. "His breathing is more stable," he admitted, glancing at his colleagues. "His heart rate is still weak, but it's stronger than yesterday." He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "I don't know how, but he's improving." Her father let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He knelt beside his daughter, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That's good news, sweetheart," he said gently. "But we still have to be careful. He's not out of danger yet." The little girl nodded, understanding the weight of his words. But in her heart, she knew, this was only the beginning of his recovery, not the end. The veterinarians began their morning assessments, carefully measuring his progress. They brought water, fresh hay, and supplements to help rebuild his strength. But even as they worked, the horse's eyes followed only one person, the little girl. She stayed by his side, whispering soft words of encouragement as they tended to him. "I knew you were strong," she said with a quiet smile. "I told them you wouldn't give up." The veterinarians, once doubtful, now exchanged quiet glances of admiration. They had seen recoveries before, but this wasn't just medicine. It was something else entirely, something fueled by a bond that no science could explain. By midday, the horse managed to take more steps, each one slow but determined. The little girl cheered softly, clapping her hands as he held his weight longer than before. And for the first time, even the veterinarians started to believe. The midday sun cast a warm glow over the field, bathing everything in golden light. A gentle breeze rustled the tall grass, carrying the scent of fresh hay and damp earth. The little girl sat cross-legged beside the horse, watching intently as he shifted his weight, testing his strength. His movements were still slow, hesitant, but there was something different about him now: determination. The veterinarians had spent the morning monitoring his condition, carefully checking his vitals. Though he was still weak, the steady improvement in his breathing and posture was undeniable. The lead veterinarian, who had once been convinced there was no hope, now watched with quiet fascination. He scribbled notes onto his clipboard before turning to the girl's father. "He's making progress," he admitted, though his voice carried a cautious tone. "But he's not fully in the clear yet. His muscles are still fragile, and he needs constant care if he's going to recover completely." The father nodded. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said firmly. "We're not giving up on him." Nearby, the little girl reached for a small wooden brush, running it gently along the horse's back. She hummed softly as she worked, her tiny hands moving with care and love. The horse closed his eyes briefly, exhaling as if soothed by her touch. "He likes it," she whispered, looking up at her parents. "He knows I'm here." The lead veterinarian observed the scene for a long moment before speaking again. "That bond she has with him," he muttered. "It's not just emotional, it's healing him." One of the other veterinarians, an older man with years of experience, nodded in agreement. "I've seen a lot of things in my time, but this is different. He should have given up. And yet, he hasn't." As the afternoon wore on, the little girl continued to stay by the horse's side, encouraging him in every small victory. When he managed to shift onto his feet without trembling, she clapped excitedly. When he took another careful step forward, she beamed with pride. Every moment, no matter how small, was a step closer to the miracle she had always believed in. As the sun began its slow descent, the veterinarians packed their equipment, agreeing to return the next morning for another evaluation. "He still has a long road ahead," the lead veterinarian warned, "but if he keeps improving at this rate, he might just pull through." The little girl's smile widened as she wrapped her small arms around the horse's neck. "You're going to be okay," she whispered against his fur. "I'll be here every day." The horse nuzzled her shoulder in response, his strength still returning but his spirit undeniably alive. And for the first time, the veterinarians weren't just hopeful, they were believers. The following morning, the sky was painted in soft hues of pink and blue as the first light of day stretched over the horizon. The little girl was already awake, sitting beside the horse with her small hands gently stroking his mane. She had refused to sleep in her bed, insisting on staying with him through the night. Her father had eventually carried out a blanket and pillow, making sure she had at least some comfort as she kept her silent vigil. The horse shifted slightly, his dark eyes flickering open as he felt her presence. He let out a low, deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he adjusted his weight. He was still weak, but there was something different in his posture now, an undeniable resilience. Her father approached, kneeling beside her. "Morning, sweetheart," he said softly, brushing her hair back from her sleepy face. "Did you rest at all?" She nodded, though she had barely closed her eyes. "I didn't want him to be alone," she whispered. Her father sighed, glancing toward the veterinarians who were arriving once again, their medical bags in hand. They had come expecting slow progress, perhaps a minor improvement at best. But as they laid eyes on the horse, their expressions shifted from skepticism to something close to astonishment. "He looks stronger," one of them murmured. The lead veterinarian approached carefully, watching as the horse flicked his ears in recognition. Kneeling beside him, he placed a careful hand against the animal's side, feeling for tension, for pain. Instead, he found something else: steadiness, strength. "I don't believe this," he muttered, running a hand over his face. Yesterday he could barely move, and now... He turned toward the girl's father, shaking his head in disbelief. "This shouldn't be happening this fast." The little girl smiled, standing up and stepping closer to her beloved horse. "Can he try walking now?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. The veterinarian hesitated. "He's still weak. We don't want to push him too soon." But before anyone could protest further, the horse shifted again, this time more deliberately. With slow, careful movements, he gathered his legs beneath him. A hush fell over the group as he pushed himself up, inch by inch, until he was standing on all fours. The little girl clapped her hands excitedly. "He did it!" she cried, bouncing on her toes. The veterinarians stared in stunned silence. The lead veterinarian stepped back, crossing his arms. "That's impossible," he whispered. He was too far gone. But the horse, as if proving them all wrong, took a step forward. Then another. His movements were slow but purposeful, his body still adjusting to its newfound strength. The little girl grinned, running alongside him, careful not to startle him. "You're doing it. You're really doing it." The other veterinarians exchanged glances, shaking their heads in disbelief. "This isn't just medicine," one of them said under his breath. "This is something else." The little girl turned to face them, her bright blue eyes filled with something they hadn't quite understood before: absolute, unwavering belief. "I told you," she said simply. "He just needed someone to believe in him." And as the horse continued walking, each step stronger than the last, not a single person watching could deny it anymore. This wasn't just recovery. This was a miracle. The air buzzed with an energy no one could explain. The veterinarians, who had once spoken with certainty about the horse's condition, now stood in stunned silence. The once motionless animal was moving, walking with slow but deliberate steps. His coat, still dull from exhaustion, gleamed faintly under the morning sun. His ears twitched, alert. His eyes, once clouded with pain, now held a quiet determination. The little girl walked beside him, her tiny steps matching his careful pace. She held her hands out as if to guide him, though she knew he didn't need it. "You're doing so good," she whispered, beaming. "I knew you could do it." Her father exchanged looks with the lead veterinarian, who was still gripping his clipboard as if it held all the answers. But at this moment, there were no answers, only disbelief. "This shouldn't be possible," the veterinarian muttered. "Even with rest, even with treatment, horses don't recover this fast." Yet here he was. The horse stopped for a moment, his large chest expanding as he took in a deep breath. Then, with a quiet huff, he moved again, this time with more confidence. He wasn't just standing. He was reclaiming his strength. The little girl clapped her hands, unable to contain her excitement. "Can he run?" she asked, turning toward the veterinarians with wide, hopeful eyes. The lead veterinarian hesitated. "He's come a long way, but we don't want him to overdo it," he cautioned. "We still don't know how much his body can handle." But the horse, as if hearing their doubts, suddenly flicked his tail and took another step forward. Then another. His muscles, though still rebuilding, moved with a rhythm that had been long forgotten. His head lifted higher, his ears pricked forward. The little girl gasped, her eyes shining with excitement. "He wants to try." Her father reached for her, but she was already running ahead, stopping just a few feet in front of the horse. "Come on," she called gently, her voice filled with warmth. "You can do it." For a moment, everything was still. The veterinarians held their breath. Her father braced himself. Then, as if defying every expectation, the horse took off. Not a full sprint, just a slow, steady trot. His legs moved with careful precision, feeling out the strength that had returned. The wind rustled through his mane as he picked up his pace, his body remembering what it was like to move freely. The little girl squealed with joy, running alongside him, her laughter carrying through the field. The veterinarians were speechless. One of them turned to the lead veterinarian, shaking his head. "We have to reconsider everything we thought we knew," he murmured. The lead veterinarian exhaled, his eyes following the horse's every movement. "This isn't science," he admitted. "This is something else." The little girl finally slowed, watching as the horse came to a natural stop a few feet ahead. He turned back toward her, his dark eyes filled with something undeniable: gratitude. She reached out and touched his nose, her voice soft. "I told you," she whispered. "You were never broken." And in that moment, it was clear, this wasn't just a recovery. This was a second chance at life. The afternoon sun stretched across the sky, casting a golden glow over the fields. The once doubtful veterinarians had now become silent observers of something they couldn't fully explain. The horse, who just days ago had been deemed too weak to survive, was now moving with growing confidence. Each step, each flick of his tail, each deep breath was proof that he was not only healing, he was thriving. The little girl stood beside him, her tiny hands resting on his side as he exhaled deeply. "You're getting stronger," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "I knew you would." She reached up, brushing a few strands of his mane away from his eyes. His ears flicked forward, his dark gaze locking onto hers as if he understood every word. Her father, watching from a few feet away, let out a deep sigh. He had always believed in science, in reason, but what he had witnessed in the past few days went beyond anything he could rationalize. He turned to the lead veterinarian, who had his arms crossed, still trying to process what was happening. "How do we explain this?" the father asked. The veterinarian hesitated before shaking his head. "We don't." His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Some things aren't meant to be explained." The other veterinarians murmured in agreement, watching as the horse stretched his neck, testing his range of motion. He pawed at the ground with his front hoof, his energy returning little by little. The little girl giggled at his movements. "You're ready," she whispered. "I can see it." Then, as if responding directly to her, the horse suddenly lifted his head high. His ears perked with excitement. The air shifted. There was an electricity between them. And then, without hesitation, he took off. Not just a trot this time. A run. His hooves pounded against the earth, each step gaining speed, strength. The wind rushed through his mane, his body moving with a grace and power that no one thought possible. The little girl's laughter rang through the air as she ran behind him, watching her best friend rediscover his freedom. The veterinarians stared, their disbelief turning into something else, admiration. "He was supposed to be too weak," one of them murmured. "But look at him now." The lead veterinarian exhaled, his voice quiet. This was never just about medicine. The horse circled the field before slowing, his chest heaving with exhilaration. He turned toward the little girl, trotting back with ease, as if to show her, "I did it." She grinned, stretching out her arms as he pressed his nose against her chest. "I knew you could," she whispered, hugging him tightly. Her father wiped a hand over his face, emotion tightening in his throat. He turned toward the lead veterinarian. "So what now?" he asked softly. The veterinarian smiled for the first time in days. "Now? Now we stop doubting and start believing." As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, one thing was clear. This wasn't just recovery. This was a miracle in motion. The evening sky was painted in breathtaking hues of crimson and gold as the sun dipped below the horizon. The warmth of the fading light cast a soft glow over the field, illuminating the triumphant figure of the once ailing horse. His coat, once dull and lifeless, now shimmered in the twilight. His dark eyes, once clouded with pain, now held a brilliance that no one could deny. The little girl stood beside him, her tiny fingers brushing through his mane as he exhaled deeply. She looked up at him, her blue eyes filled with pure happiness. "You're back," she whispered, as if the words themselves could seal the moment in time. Her father, standing a few feet away with the veterinarians, could hardly believe what he was seeing. Days ago, they had stood in this very spot, preparing to say goodbye. Now, they watched as the horse, strong and proud, stood tall, his posture exuding the quiet dignity of a survivor. The lead veterinarian shook his head in disbelief. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, "but he's fully recovered. This is extraordinary." The little girl turned toward them, smiling as if she had known this all along. "I told you," she said softly. "He just needed time. And love." The horse let out a deep, contented breath, lowering his head so that she could press her forehead against his. For a moment, there was no sound, just the quiet pulse of life between them, the unbreakable bond that had defied logic, science, and doubt. Then, as if to prove he was truly healed, the horse suddenly lifted his head and took off across the open field. His hooves thundered against the earth, his body moving with the speed and grace of an animal that had been given a second chance. The little girl watched with shining eyes, her laughter ringing out as he galloped freely, his spirit unchained. Her father turned to the lead veterinarian. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. The veterinarian smiled, watching the horse run with effortless strength. "Now? He lives." The little girl took a deep breath, closing her eyes for just a second as the wind carried the scent of earth, grass, and freedom. When she opened them again, her best friend was galloping back toward her, his dark eyes filled with something unshakable: trust, love, gratitude. As he slowed to a stop in front of her, she reached up and gently touched his muzzle. "You were never broken," she whispered. "You were always meant to fight." And with that, the horse let out a final, powerful breath, one that carried the weight of his journey, the strength of his will, and the beauty of his unbreakable bond with the little girl who had never stopped believing in him. This wasn't just a recovery. This was a miracle. And it was only the beginning.